Welcome to Kong Summit 2020. I'm John Boone from Comcast.
And I'm Tyler Rivera from Comcast.
We're here to present Comcast's self-service API gateway development journey. Next slide. I'll start by providing the business environment information so you can understand the context in which we undertook this journey. Next slide. We had a large shift in our internal culture, which was focused on customer experience. And that drove a need to reorganize organizationally, which made it necessary to change things to execute effectively on the feedback we gathered through various metrics that we use like NPS. Next slide. This meant the way we did our work changed as well. We shifted from working with internal data center hosting bare metal systems to working with public cloud offerings so we could offer the best-in-class or take advantage of best-in-class services and features that weren't necessarily available internally. We also had a penchant for monolithic artifacts, and there were various associated issues regarding ongoing maintenance and technical debt reduction that we had to weigh against feature development and deployment complexity in these monolithic deployments. So we thought it would be better to pursue a process of decomposition by peeling the onion, so to speak, and gradually reducing the size and scope of the artifacts that were monolithic and replacing them with microservices. And thirdly, the customer experience focus is not just gathering feedback for us. It means we need to empower the developers to be empathetic and responsive to customers' needs and perceptions. Next slide. There were some implications of this change. The shift in focus toward improved customer experience led to strong efforts to move security to the left by building it in rather than bolting it on. And this means that services that are developed or deployed have to be deployed within security frameworks that are as close as possible to the ones that they are ultimately deployed to production. So a shift to public cloud offerings was made in a way that was complementary and compatible with security frameworks as they improved over time. Additionally, new services with cloud scale performance allowed us to reimagine our product implementations, in some cases leading to drastic simplifications in product deployment and operations. With the proliferation of APIs associated with our microservice approach, a very large burden was being added to the client teams, tracking appropriate hosts for calling these APIs across multiple environments, in addition to knowing how to use the APIs. Another byproduct of our shift toward improved customer experience was the way it became a constituent part of our interworking culture. Not only do we want to improve the end user's experience, but we want to delight our development partners as well. Next slide. So in response to these implications, we look to leverage shared infrastructure where reasonable and practical. We also look to add an API gateway for API management and provide abstractions that simplify connectivity requirements. And finally, we want to empower the developers through self-service administration. Next slide. We undertook a process for evaluating how we would deploy an API gateway. This process involved figuring out what potential open source or proprietary source candidates we could evaluate, then evaluating them against our needs. After we evaluated them against our needs, any gaps we identified would have to be then further evaluated in order to figure out how to bridge those gaps. And if that involved purchasing enterprise editions of software or writing custom code ourselves. Once we had determined that, we had to gauge effort in terms of time and money to do that the gap bridging. And finally, we selected a candidate for proof of concept implementation. And that candidate was the community edition of Kong. After completing a successful proof of concept, we implemented the solution in production using the community edition. And then we were able to build a business case based on that for switching to either the enterprise edition or building extra features needed to bridge the gaps as appropriate in particular cases. So some of the requirements that we had for the API gateway were non-negotiables, like we wanted a single host name for reaching all the relevant APIs. We also wanted to be able to validate our own internal versions of JOTS that we use for authentication and authorization. And we wanted to be able to provide the self-service goals in terms of administration of services and routes within the API gateway. And additionally, we had a hard performance limit as well. In our implementation, it was necessary that whatever the gateway candidate was, it did not introduce more than 50 milliseconds of additional latency in processing the request. Next slide.
All right. Thanks a lot, John. My name is Tyler Rivera, and I'm going to talk a bit about how we actually implemented Kong and how we migrated over to the Enterprise edition of Kong and some of the challenges that we encountered there, and specifically a lot of interaction that we had with the open source community around Kong. So to start and give folks a little bit of context, I wanted to talk a little bit about our initial toolkit. These are some open source tools that we find in our toolbox and that we use frequently. These are a set of tools that are, I would say, fairly ops focused tools. Our team is a fairly ops focused team. So the initial toolkit that we used reflects that. And where I think most of this starts is with Ansible. We use Ansible to define roles and playbooks. We use Packer to basically leverage those roles that we've defined in Ansible and bake them into an image that we then propagate out to our various environments. We test all those images with Gauss during the image building process. And then we manage all of our infrastructure in public cloud accounts using Terraform. So I wanted to point this out because this becomes important in how we made some initial decisions around how we're deploying and managing Kong. So just a quick architectural overview of how we were initially set up with Community Edition. This diagram is very simple, and the main point here is just to point out that we're running Kong in 2 separate regions, and we are running databases. We are basically setting up our Kong instances to be backed by RDS instances in each region. So they basically, there's no replication happening across regions. They are just 2 separate databases with identical configuration in each. The way that we look to configure these instances to begin with was to use Kong Terraform provider. So we defined all of our services and routes and plugin information within Terraform, and then propagated that out to both our East and West regions concurrently. So this worked fairly well, but it was fairly slow going. The way that we were managing services coming on board and using the gateway was that, you know, we would have a ticket come in, and somebody on our team, the API gateway team, would actually craft their request into Terraform configuration and then propagate that out through our CI/CD pipelines. And this tended to be could be a fairly slow process, and we realized wasn't a great developer experience for users. Once we moved over to Enterprise Edition, we introduced Kong Manager. For those who are not familiar with Kong Manager is essentially a Kong instance that provides a GUI interface, like a web interface for users to configure services and plugins and routes, upstreams, etc., in workspaces within within Kong. And the goal in implementing Kong Manager was essentially to provide teams with the ability to self-service their APIs. So as opposed to the previous model where we're propagating things out with Terraform, we now have a model where folks are going in via Kong Manager and making the changes to their APIs there, and then propagating those propagating those changes out to the proxy instances. This model meant that not only are we now managing configuration of services and routes, plugins, etc., we also have to manage Kong manager or admin entities, enterprise entities within Kong. So we now have to manage the admin accounts that are being used in Kong Manager, the workspaces, and roles and permissions that are associated with those. So this brought up a whole new set of questions that our team had to answer. Those questions were, how do we manage Kong workspace creation? How do we manage the admin entities themselves? And how do we manage access controls for admins as they log into the system? And the proposals that we came up with for this were, well, we want to automate workspace creation based on existing team structure. This meant that it made sense in our case to let teams sort of self-organize the way that their teams are structured. So all of this doesn't necessarily tie back to a really great enterprise model like an AD group or something like that. It works a lot better if teams are able to dynamically create the team structure they want. And the best tool for them to do that, and something they're very familiar with, is GitHub. So we basically mapped workspace creation to team creation in GitHub. The other question was, how do we manage Kong admins? And we wanted to make sure that teams had full control over who has access to their workspaces in the control plane. So we had to find a way to manage that and to do it in a fairly automated way. We also wanted to use that same sort of model for access controls. So really pushing to the teams all the ability to craft the structure of their teams and how access to their workspaces work all themselves via some automated process. So we started evaluating solutions on how we might do this. We had been using the Kong Terraform provider, as I showed in the previous slide there, and that was working fairly well for us to manage various parts of Kong. But one big gap was that there's no support for enterprise entities within the Terraform provider. So the first thing that we looked at was to basically extend this provider to support EE endpoints like workspaces, admins, users, roles, and permissions. For those who aren't familiar with how a Terraform provider works, this diagram on the right basically shows the structure there. So you have a Terraform provider, which is written in Go, that's going to define a set of resources that you're going to manipulate. And then those resources leverage some sort of API binding. In this case, it was using a project called GoKong. And GoKong is essentially calling out to the Kong admin API to make those operations and basically coalesce state into what we've defined in our Terraform configuration. So in doing that, we discovered a set of challenges. We found that the provider itself and the Go client, GoKong, were not actively maintained. We also realized that if we wanted to allow our dev teams to leverage this sort of pattern to manage their own services, that they might not necessarily have a great deal of Terraform experience. We have a huge range of developer teams within Comcast and a huge range of skill sets within. So we weren't sure if ops-focused tooling like Terraform would be a great fit. And ultimately, we realized that this setup doesn't necessarily fit our roadmap with where we want to go with delivering an API gateway to our teams. So we took this problem out into the open and started engaging with the community. We had an open discussion about the existing Terraform provider to see what level of community support might be there. We engaged with a Kong engineer to get his feedback on what he felt might be possible as far as support. and was actually able to add that engineer as a maintainer on the provider project. And we also made the decision to migrate the existing provider over to different Go API binding called Go-Kong, which was supported by that engineer, and which since that time, since we initially engaged the community, that project, Go-Kong, has actually moved into the Kong org proper in GitHub. So we decided to migrate all this stuff to Go-Kong. That project is also leveraged by Deck, which some folks might be familiar with, and it's much more actively maintained. We realized that in shifting work, some of this extension work that we wanted to do to support enterprise, it would also open up the possibility of providing that support in Deck. So we felt that it was a good opportunity not only to provide a solution for our team, but also to provide a great foundation to provide additional features for tooling like Deck. So this is an architectural overview of what things looked like once we were able to extend Go-Kong to provide support for enterprise entities. Essentially, Kong Manager still acts as the source of truth for all of our services and plugins and routes. We now manage that using Deck. So Kong Manager acts as ingress for any kind of configuration changes. And then we have a process that propagates those changes out to our proxy instances. We then have a set of automation that we've built to manage enterprise entities using our Go-Kong extensions. And that is essentially managing the admins, the roles, and the permissions that are organized via GitHub in our enterprise GitHub instance. So all of the admins and roles and permissions and whatnot are automated via that and propagated out to both the manager and the proxies. So once we were able to extend Go-Kong, we developed a set of tools to develop some more internal tooling. We developed a CLI that we use to migrate services between workspaces. We built a tool to provision global plugins to workspaces. One interesting thing that we found in moving to Enterprise Edition is, and moving to workspaces, is that there is no longer this idea of a global plugin. The top level for a plugin in Enterprise Edition is actually the workspace. So we had to find a way to manage those plugins for teams. These are plugins that we want to manage at an ops team level and make sure are provisioned to all workspaces that are working in the API gateway. We also, built some tools to easily onboard users and teams according to the abstractions that we created at the Comcast level and to manage role assignment. Just wanted to mention some other open source tools that we use here. Deck, as I mentioned previously, we manage that at our team to create some loopback services and management services to make operation of the platform a lot easier. And we also use that to propagate configuration from Kong Manager or the control plane to our data plane instances. In the future, we'd really like to introduce Deck to a lot of our development teams so that they can start using a declarative configuration to manage their services and plugins. Right now, they're mostly making changes through the Kong Manager interface. And I also wanted to shout out Pongo here. As John mentioned in his part of the presentation, we do have some custom plugins that we write, and that open source tool has been a great resource for us to test plugins that we're building to improve the experience of our developers. So, just continuing our journey here, our #1 goal is to provide a solution for teams that really reduce any friction in their ability to create services and to create services that ultimately delight our customers, right? That's our ultimate goal at Comcast. So in doing that, I mentioned before, we'd like to familiarize teams with Deck. We think it's a fantastic tool and could provide some excellent patterns for teams to rapidly deploy their services and routes and plugins. We'd like to develop patterns around Deck that they can use within our CI/CD platforms to quickly spin up services and change them. And we'd also like to centralize a lot of the API spec that we have floating around in various teams into a centralized place using the Kong developer portal. We think that there's a huge opportunity there once we have everything in the API gateway to start leveraging a lot of that knowledge so that you can get easier cross interaction between teams. So now that EE support exists in GoKong, we'd like to extend enterprise entity management to Deck. We realize that a lot of the API endpoints for these enterprise entities were built under the assumption that they'd probably be used by Kong Manager. So we'd like to work closely with the community to extend that functionality to Deck. We feel like it might be a bit easier to manage those entities there. We'd like to continue to push innovation out into the open. The stuff that we're building at Comcast, I'm super excited about. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us to continue to give back to the open source community. And yeah, I'd like to continue to engage with the Kong engineers. I've worked closely with Harry Bagdi over the past couple of months on a lot of this work. And yeah, I'd just like to continue that conversation with Kong engineers and also bring other Kong users, people from the Kong community into the fold to really open up discussion around a lot of the things we're building, because I think the more voices that we can have in that sort of development, the better the solutions are going to be. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. We'll open it up at this point for questions. Thank you.